DOE CSGF Fellow Riley Brady in the field of ocean biogeochemistry at the University of Colorado.
Hi everybody, my name is Riley Brady and today I'm going to be sharing results from my Los Alamos practicum from summer 2018, where I used the DOE's climate model to better understand how carbon circulates from the Southern Ocean abyss to the ocean surface. And this is work I did with my Los Alamos advisors Matt Maltrud and Phil Wolfram, as well as my advisor at CU, Nikki Lewandowski, and a fellow grad student at MIT, Henri Drake. So I want to start out by framing the ocean as this great mitigator of anthropogenic climate change. We burn fossil fuels and emit CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's growing at this exponential rate. But the ocean actually sequesters about 1/3 of the emissions, and the terrestrial biosphere sequesters another 1/3. So we have a much lower atmospheric CO2 content than we could without these two systems. And on the left and right, I'm showing these maps of the climatology of sea to air CO2 flux. So anywhere it's blue, the ocean's taking up carbon, and anywhere it's red, the ocean's actually outgassing carbon. So at first glance, you see it's this really spatially heterogeneous system, and it depends on the ocean circulation and the local biology. I'm going to focus in on the right side, the Southern Ocean, which borders Antarctica, and that's going to be the focus of my talk today. We think a lot about the global carbon cycle and how it relates to the Southern Ocean because while the ocean takes up 1/3 of anthropogenic carbon emissions, the Southern Ocean takes up 40% of the total ocean's uptake. And you can really see that massive blue band of carbon in that Southern Ocean region that's really outlined here. Now, why does the Southern Ocean take up so much carbon? It's mostly physical and biological in terms of the reasoning, but what we're looking at here is this theoretical schematic of a zonally averaged Southern Ocean. So you just average across that entire longitude band at each latitude on the x-axis. And what you're seeing here is the overturning circulation in the Southern Ocean. So we have these really strong winds that are heading eastward that flow around 50 degrees south here, and these drive the Antarctic circumpolar current, which circulates the entire Southern Ocean. And due to the rotation of the Earth coupled with the winds, we get this geostrophic balance we call Ekman balance here, really, where you get this overturning cell that's driven by the winds. So you have these deep and moderate waters that are upwelling to the surface, and they're bringing a ton of carbon to the surface because phytoplankton sink out and are dissolved by bacteria, and that's reversing photosynthesis and injecting CO2 back in the waters. So actually, near the Antarctic continent, we get outgassing of CO2 to the atmosphere. But the really important part of this system is that we have these mode waters forming here, these really cold waters that have high absorptivity with regards to CO2. And then the wind circulation, really the wind stress curl here, is forcing waters to sequester carbon here. So it's continually removing carbon from the surface. So here we really see this broad CO2 uptake. Now, all of the system is highly variable. I showed you climatology and a zonal average, but here in blue is this neural network product that's trying to back out to the sea to air CO2 flux over the past few decades. And what this is showing is that there's actually substantial decadal variability here. So we're in this anomaly space here in petagrams of carbon per year. So it's always a sink, it's just the strength of the sink that's varying. And note that when we're in the scale of petagrams of carbon, this is varying by upwards of 1 billion tons of carbon over this decadal scale. So it's this really highly variable system. It's really hard to measure because it's a harsh environment. So we tend to measure in the summer. We tend to measure with resupply ships that go from South America to the Antarctic Peninsula. But we really don't have a fundamental understanding of the carbon cycle in the Southern Ocean. Now, one last point I want to make in what motivated this study is, I talk about how it's a variable system. The Southern Ocean is really important in taking up carbon, and we don't really have great measurements. But another thing to keep in mind is that we're sort of revising our textbook zonally symmetric view of that overturning. So we have this nice textbook look at how, ocean water upwells across the Antarctic circumpolar current, but in reality, it's zonally asymmetric. So this is just a purely physical study done with a high-resolution climate model, and they're using these Lagrangian particles so they can trace out the pathways of ocean circulation. And anywhere it's red, there's a lot of particles upwelling into that domain. So if we had the zonally symmetric view, this entire region, which is the Antarctic circumpolar current, would all be red. But rather, these hotspots are organized around rough topography, or bathymetry as we call it in the ocean. These blue outlines are regions of high eddy kinetic energy, which is a proxy for topography. And you see that it's really this ocean topography that's driving these hotspots. So we really have this sort of newer zonally asymmetric view, and this really inspired us to ask, what does this mean for carbon? So the two main questions I wanted to answer with these model simulations at Los Alamos were, are these hotspots associated with enriched carbon? So essentially, can we replicate these hotspots of upwelling, and is there a lot of carbon coming up there? And secondly, where is this carbon enriched water coming from that's fueling these hotspots? So I'm going to start out by talking a lot about the model simulation, which probably most people will be interested in here given us being in the CSGF. So I ran a global simulation of the DOE's model for prediction across scales ocean, that's MPAS-O. We have ocean biogeochemistry turned on, which incurs a huge cost. So we have the full carbon cycle, some phytoplankton, zooplankton, nutrients. And on the left, you see what the model looks like. This is the model mesh. It's this Voronoi tessellation where we've got these tessellated hexagons that pack into each other. This is super advantageous if you want to refine specific regions. We didn't do that in this study, but we're really excited about this mesh. And on the right, you see the grid scale as you move across latitudes, so from South Pole at the left to North Pole at the right. And you see we're spanning this 10 to 30 kilometer range. Classic climate models right now, the most standard simulations are 100 kilometers, so this is definitely in the high resolution range. And in the Southern Ocean in particular, we're hitting scales of 15 kilometers, which is great for resolving mesoscale eddies. And for those that are interested, we completed 50 total years of climate model simulation. We used about 10,000 CPU cores for running this on the Los Alamos computer Grizzly, and this amounts to about 10 million CPU hours for the simulation. So they were super generous with their time to run this simulation. And what you get out of this is, frankly, a really beautiful view of the world's oceans. And we have nutrients and carbon, which is super exciting for me at this high resolution. Now, we're talking about the Southern Ocean today, but this shows you that we did this globally so that we can get teleconnections from the tropics into the Southern Ocean. And if you want to investigate other things, you can. But we're looking at a snapshot of surface nitrate here. And you can see at this high resolution, we have these filaments and mesoscale eddies off the California current. You can make out the loop current of the Gulf Stream, and the Gulf Stream as it detaches from the eastern seaboard here. Now, we weren't satisfied just with this Eulerian simulation, where you just solve PDEs in the grid cells, and our grid cell carbon is the manifestation of air-sea fluxes, biology, mixing and transport from all over. We wanted to actually trace out where the carbon was coming from. So we turned on the Lagrangian particle simulator that Phil Wolfram has developed in MPAS. So at every red dot here, we seeded a float, and we put 1 million of these floats globally. And at each red dot, we actually have 15 layers of floats, and they're passively three-dimensional floats. So they just get advected by the ocean currents, like a phytoplankton would, or an oil parcel, or just a parcel of carbon-enriched water. And we do this for 17 years. So we have output every 2 days for 17 years, and they've got these onboard sensors. So not only do we have their XYZ trajectory, but they can measure the tracers around them. So the temperature, the salinity, the density. They can measure nutrients, they can measure oxygen, carbon, and this is really what we're going to leverage to understand where the carbon's coming from. And note that I added the biogeochemical sensors to this system, and it's one of those things that you think is really easy, but we fought bugs for a year, but it finally worked. And now we get this awesome view of how the ocean flows. So that Eulerian simulation gives us these grid cell averages, but now we can actually trace out the ocean flow here. So this is just 1 month of surface flow, and it's colored by the trajectory, or covered by the temperature that the floats are measuring. And you can really see the Antarctic circumpolar current here as we move around. You can see the formation of massive persistent gyres and the Antarctic circumpolar countercurrent here. So it's this really amazing utility we have. I'm briefly going to switch over here to a video I made from our simulation. And here it's the same as what we were just looking at, but now this is dissolved inorganic carbon. So here the trajectories are occurring over this 500 to 2,000 meter depth range, and the colors are the dissolved carbon. So the yellow is deplete with carbon, and the more purple colors are enriched with carbon. But here you see the important sort of mesoscale activity in the Southern Ocean, where you have these eddies forming that are churning and transporting carbon with them. And you can see here how, using this Lagrangian simulation, we can really start to probe the system and understand where the carbon's coming from and how it flows. And now that I've showed you this sort of setup that I'm really excited by, I get to make a lot of cool videos and send them out on Twitter and stuff. I'm going to show you a little bit of the science results. We're not done with the study, and I'm limited in time here. So I'll sort of breeze through this to kind of show you what we've been doing in analyzing this. So the first thing we wanted to do was to see if we got those upwelling hotspots that were shown in previous studies. So here I'm just looking at the physical transport of these particles. We're similar to the Veronica Tamsitt study I showed earlier. I'm coloring it red where the based on the particle density crossing at 1,000 meters depth. And again, you see that we have these hotspots here. So it's not organized into this broad band of upwelling everywhere, but we have these 4 regions where a lot of the upwelling's happening, and they coincide with the same regions in previous studies. And now I've boxed out these regions on a bathymetry map, and you notice again that these are really associated with topography. So you have seamounts here and shelves and ridges and all sorts of things that are really driving this eddy activity and spinning up that overturning circulation and causing these particles to upwell. And note lastly that they are really disproportionate. They're associated with 72% of the total upwelling. So these are the regions we want to zone in on for this analysis. So I'm lastly going to show you some results from this memory time analysis. I don't have time to explain the methodology here, but you can ping me after or look out for a paper, hopefully in the near future, that explains how we did this. But we're going to use this method to understand where the carbon's coming from. And it's a statistical method where essentially you look at the autocorrelation function of these particles and use that to back out when the carbon decorrelates on the particle time series. And you can look at sort of the origin of that parcel. So here I'm showing the results of the origin of carbon based on this memory time analysis. So each panel here, the blue box is that ensemble of particles based on those regions I just showed you. So for each box, we have something like 5,000 particle trajectories we can look at because they all upwelled in this region. And then for each particle, you look at when the carbon decorrelates in terms of the autocorrelation function, and you trace it back and look at where it started, essentially, statistically. And so the decorrelation time scale or memory time for all of these ensembles is actually about 2 years. So the carbon retains its properties for 2 years until it's sort of transformed by mixing or biology. And you'll notice, unsurprisingly, for each of these regions, that the carbon's coming from downstream or upstream of the ACC it's getting delivered in. But there is a lot of carbon that comes from locally within the box. So it still takes 2 years to upwell within that box. And I'm going to show some violin plots here, where this is really just for each region the distribution of that particle ensemble. This first one is the zonal origin, the longitudinal origin of this dissolved inorganic carbon. And the regions I'm really intrigued by is this Drake Passage and Campbell Plateau region that, although these are sort of extremes in the distribution, they're still sourcing water parcels from the entire ACC, so all 180 or all 360 degrees of it. Whereas the Kerguelen and Crozet are bringing a lot more local waters. And then we can do the same thing for the meridional or latitudinal origin. And the region I really want to point out here is this Kerguelen Plateau that's actually bringing waters from the subtropics. It's spanning thousands of kilometers in latitude space. And I'll show you here, this is the Kerguelen. It's really pulling in waters from this Agulhas current, this Agulhas retroflexion. So it's actually bringing in these subtropical waters, which is really cool. And one of the last things I want to show you here is now we're looking at violin plots for the dissolved inorganic carbon at the source. So the actual amount of carbon that's coming up in terms of this micromole per kilogram concentration. And on the left for each region, you see that we've got a pretty wide distribution of the amount of carbon coming up. So the Drake Passage in particular is bringing up waters with the most enriched carbon. But on the right, you can look at the density in terms of the density of the seawater that it originates from. And these are these oceanography units for density, but we can split them into different water masses. So Antarctic intermediate water, upper circumpolar deep water, and lower circumpolar deep water. And at first order, it's really across all systems, we're bringing up the same type of water. It's a lot of upper circumpolar deep water, but they're quite variable in their DIC, and their dissolved inorganic carbon. So this implies that there's something decoupled from the actual circulation, and that means likely that biology is transforming waters differently in these regions. The last thing I want to show here is where these waters end up. So we looked at for each ensemble where the carbon came from. So it all came from sort of upstream, upwards to 1,000 kilometers upstream of the region. But this is where, after it crosses 1,000 meters, where those particles enter the mixed layer. So the portion of, it's like the boundary layer in the ocean that interacts with the atmosphere. And this really has important implications in my mind, because this is showing, for the Drake Passage and Crozet Plateau at least, a lot of those waters stay locally, so they sort of get mixed around there and influence the local environment. But for the Campbell Plateau and Krell Plateau, these waters end up upwelling hundreds of thousands of kilometers downstream. So they're transformed in these regions, but end up influencing regions downstream. So when we look at these air-sea gas flux pictures of the Southern Ocean and say, oh, there's these hot spots of upwelling, and we might be missing some strong outgassing here, let's say, it could actually be transformed and originated from thousands of kilometers away, essentially. It's not this immediate sort of, it upwells here and outgasses here. So I want to summarize real quick, because I'm running out of time, that I ran this high-resolution Eulerian Lagrangian simulation to identify these hotspots of upwelling in the Southern Ocean. Something I didn't show here is that we used the memory time to estimate for these ensembles of particles that the memory of carbon is about 2 years in the Southern Ocean, so it takes 2 years to be upwelled and transformed. And lastly, we did some finer scale analysis on these ensembles to understand where the carbon's coming from and different characteristics of it. So I want to end here with a slide on what I learned from the CSGF and from this practicum. The first is that it takes a lot of time to run a climate model experiment. We thought we were going to finish it that summer, but it ended up taking a whole year of remote babysitting, because you're trying to add in the sensors for biogeochemistry, and it just kept breaking. And Fortran bugs are hard to decode for a million-line climate model. I would tell myself back then to be liberal with the model output I saved out. We had a different project idea originally, and we transitioned to this. And there's some other variables I wish we had on disk, but there's space limitations. Lastly, in terms of this side of things, open source Python development is awesome. I started it at Los Alamos. They got me spun up with contributing to their packages, and it's led to me releasing this package ClimPred, which is for the climate prediction community, and it's slowly taking off, but we've done a lot of work to help analyze climate forecasts. On the fun side, the Los Alamos folks take ultimate frisbee really seriously. I played a bit that summer. It's really hard at that altitude, and there are some really good players there. And lastly, for anybody who's younger and is thinking about practicums, New Mexico is a hidden gem. So whichever lab you're at in New Mexico, they have really beautiful outdoor scenes. So I'm going to end here with a few pictures I took that summer. We traveled all over to different national parks and national historic sites. And it was a really wonderful experience. So thanks to the organizers, thanks to my fellows. It's a bummer that we aren't at the meeting this summer, but this has been a really wonderful 4 years with everybody. So thank you.